Everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the article on which the church stands or falls. And you might be thinking that means I'm talking about the article of Justification. But that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, as I said, the article on which the church stands or falls. And in the Reformation context, that was applied to the doctrine of justification. But today I'm going to be discussing whether or not that is the case today. And I already recorded this once, and I realized I had two audio input sources going, both my microphone and then a duplicate of my microphone, which sounded horrible. So now I'm redoing it. And I got a beer because I'm obligated to drink when I make videos, because I started that when we made the channel, and so now I'm stuck with it. And I didn't have a beer in the first one, so it had to be redone anyhow, I suppose, right? But the reason I got this topic was because Samuel had mentioned in chat that I should do a video on this topic because I had discussed it before. What he didn't know was that I just got this from a lecture from Dr. Mace. And I recommend you check out this whole lecture. The lecture is on Lenore Record, which is Gene Wilkins' channel. And he posts a bunch of lectures and presentations from all the big conferences, not all the big conferences, but a lot of the big conferences in the LCMS, specifically the ones on the more confessional and liturgical conservative side of the LCMS. And so this is from a large lecture series that Dr. Ben Mace did on Gerhard, and it's over 20 lectures long. So I recommend the whole thing. It's really one of the best lecture series on YouTube. In fact, I think it probably is, in my opinion, the best Lutheran theology lecture series on the internet. It's not like it's comprehensive systematic theology of every single topic, but Mays is very insightful. He's very intelligent. He's extraordinarily well read. He goes through Gerhard and offers a lot of his own thoughts along the way. And insights he's bringing from other theologians. And he covers a lot of relevant topics to today in particular, and brings to light a lot of things that are under-discussed. So please subscribe to Lenore Record, one of the best channels on YouTube, and watch the whole lecture series. But we're going to be focusing on this section from about 1956 onward for several minutes. So I'm not going to offer commentary as the clip runs. I'm just going to let the clip go, and we're going to, discuss after that.
See what I'm saying?
So when I arrived at seminary, I still don't really know what I even think of this. Or just says, Adrian, there's a canon within a canon. And then I talked to other pastors that disagreed with that. Then there's professors that almost see this progression in the epistles, like the epistles are explaining what the Lord Jesus did. So the epistles are the epitome of theology, but then if you read David Scare, he would say that the epistles really are the servants of the gospel, particularly in his treatment of the epistle of James. He's saying the best way to understand James is through the Gospels. And so I'm just kind of, when you're talking about the most clear passages, then you have all Scripture is God breathed. And so.
Right. So what's the question again?
I'm talking and wanting you to make sense of what's rolling around. So I don't know the question. It's kind of, is there a canon within a canon? That would be a question.
There's some obscurity there. Some obscurity. I hear what you're saying. I'm not exactly sure what is meant when some people say there's a canon within the canon, unless what they mean is that there really is a rule of faith. I think there kind of is. There is a rule of faith, and we should definitely keep that rule of faith front and center. And maybe the problem is that some people are defining the rule of faith as being the doctrine of justification as taught in the epistle of St. Paul to the Galatians, period, as opposed to the doctrine, the analogy of faith being the Ten Commandments, the Apostles' Creed, wherever it's found in the Scriptures, the Lord's Prayer, and the passages on the sacraments. So if there are people that are teaching that, for example, the doctrine of justification found in the epistle to the Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians is the analogy of faith, I would disagree with that. I would not want to say that, because I think what Paul is doing, if you just look at what Paul is doing, is he's always commenting on the work of Christ and the work of the Holy Spirit. And all of what he's doing is really in connection with what the Gospels have given us about Christ.
I mean, here would be another one. The article of justification is that upon which the church stands or falls. So like that would be the rule of faith. And I'm just anymore saying, okay,
I agree that there are some people that probably think that. And again, I think that I'm a historian, a church historian and theological historian, so I really think that you have to kind of look at these, where do these cliches come from, and what's the context in which they are first coined? And I think David Scarrett has said it well, that in the book of 1 Corinthians, the doctrine upon which the church stands and falls is the resurrection. But I would also say that in the book of Galatians, the doctrine upon which the church stands and falls is the doctrine of justification. And so it kind of depends on what is the situation in which the church finds itself. What are the main threats to the church at this day and age? To say that for all time and eternity, justification is always the only doctrine on which the church stands and falls, I think that's incorrect.
I think that's kind of where we've come in some ways that frustrate me as a pastor in our study, and in part the Lutheran confessions have done it to us because they are speaking to their day and their times, and what is being battled and contended for is the forgiveness of sins and the nature of the forgiveness of sins. But that is in a particular day and time, and now we are pastors in a different day and time, and that still holds to be true, but the gospel, when it's defined so narrowly, or in cliches, doctrine on which church stands falls, something like this, I just am trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, well, let me tell you what we're doing at the Fort these days to try to combat some of this cliche theology, and that's we changed the historical theology sequence. So now there's early church, and we're skipping medieval, and we're doing Reformation for one class, and we're doing modern church for one class. And for a long time, it was early church, medieval church, and then Reformation all the way to the present, which meant that you got quite a bit of Reformation and not very much of modern church. And what people really have to understand is that nowadays the main threat, the main doctrine that the world is trying to undermine is not really the forgiveness of sins, but is rather the historic reality that there was a Jesus Christ who did all these things and really rose from the dead. And you know, this kind of existential experience, or this existential approach to Christianity is I think, much more of a what most people are trying to push on us, or is just kind of in the air. And so how do we respond to that? You might say that nowadays the doctrine on which the church stands and falls is even something like the creation, that God made us male and female, or the fact that there really was, that God's Son truly became incarnate and became a man of the Virgin Mary and truly died and rose. And so there are various aspects that are at various different times in history become more challenged and more attacked and have to be then defended specifically at that point. And I think that knowing our current context and culture well will help us, and also if we know the history of the Reformation era well, will help us to value and treasure the doctrine of justification as it's necessary. And it is necessary to teach that because it's so important for consciences that are troubled by their sins, but then also to realize that there's a lot of people that's not the main problem that they're facing nowadays. All right, so that's my answer, and we're going to go over here to Kurt.
All right, well, that's the end of the clip. I can't speak to whether his situation at the fort, that is to say, Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, I can't speak to whether that is a good or bad solution to their historical teaching issue, because I've also heard from students now that they felt because they skipped over medieval theology that they feel like there's a big chasm in their knowledge gap. Not sure which problem is worse, to have a big chasm of knowledge about the Middle Ages, or a deficiency in understanding the modern theological context. But I can comment on the rest of it more, because that's the actual topic of this video. I think that Dr. Mace is correct here in his assessment that the article on which the church stands or falls was justification in the time of the Reformation, but is not necessarily that today. And that the rule of faith is, as he says, the 6 chief parts, as we talk about in the Catechism: the 10 Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, the passages about baptism, the Lord's Supper, and the office of the keys. And that needs to be the central focus of, our basic Christian life, because that's the summation of it all. And if we stray away from that, we're going to end up in problems. But more to the point, I think there is an issue here where, because of this cliche phrase and because it's been recycled, our preaching and our pastoral care has become so focused on this addressing of consciences who are terrified by the law that we have lost probably the bigger issues that we have today in our congregations, in terms of, the actual issues that congregants have as people. Because we don't live in the Middle Ages, where everyone has been beaten so hard with the law by the Roman Catholic Church, which was integrally tied into the state at the time, and everyone's day-to-day life, that at that time, people's consciences were terrified about going to hell because, or spending a long time in purgatory, millions of years perhaps, in purgatory, for various sins they left unconfessed, or because people aren't buying enough indulgences for their soul while they're in purgatory, things like this. But that is not the context where we live today. In fact, in the U.S., I'm speaking mostly to a U.S. context here. I can't speak for the rest of the world because I don't live there, and I don't know it as well. I think a lot of what I'm going to say here applies to the Western Church more broadly. But I'm going to be speaking specifically for the U.S. context in the 21st century, more particularly 2025, which is when I'm recording and releasing this. I think that we have issues today in the article of creation, and not the article of justification so much. In fact, I think, broadly speaking, in the U.S., if you're going to a Protestant church, they probably have an okay grasp of the doctrine of justification. There are going to be problems in a lot of the churches, but I think they have an okay grasp of it, substantially better than what was being taught in the Middle Ages for the doctrine of justification. And I think, if anything, the direction of error that you're going to see in churches today in the U.S., on average, I think it's going to be a sort of antinomianism that's being preached, or a free grace, easy believism. I think it's going to be more common than the alternative errors of like what you see in the Roman Catholic Church, or what you see in some lordship salvation circles, where they end up being very law heavy. That's an issue too, but I think on average, you're going to have more of this sort of free grace, easy believism, antinomianism being taught. And even in our own synod, I'd say this is a big problem. In fact, if you go watch the backlog of Lunar Record videos, you'll see a lot of lectures on soft antinomianism, the third use of the law, preaching the law gospel reductionism, these types of issues, because it's an issue in our synod. But I think it's beating dead horse to talk more about that particular concern. And what I'd like to talk about here now is the article of creation, and how that is probably the main article today on which the church stands or falls. Now, Dr. Mace does mention issues about just the existence of God, or that Christianity is true in general, that Jesus was God, or that he did the things he said he did in the Bible, that the Bible, it portrays historical events. Those things are all obviously things that people who are not Christians in the West, more particularly in America, people who are not Christians in America don't believe those things, of course. Now, some people believe there's a God if they're a different religion, of course. And it's not like belief in God is extraordinarily low. I mean, it's way lower than other points in history today. But the reason for low belief in God is not like some deep apologetics conversation. A lot of people, if they have any reasons at all, they're fairly pop level. And for most people, it's more like a qualified agnosticism, where it's just that they don't follow any particular religion. They don't see God as all that important. And whether or not God exists is not, very relevant, they think, to their day-to-day life. And so I don't think that really the existence of God is necessarily the article on which the church stands or falls today, or even necessarily you could say that the truth of historical events in Scripture or something like that. Those things are very relevant still. There are things we need to defend. But for the most part, the reason people are doubting those things has little to do with reasoned arguments. It has more to do with shifting culture. And I'd contend that a lot of the issues in shifting culture today come back to the article of creation once again. The most obvious and easily applicable example of this is the LGBT issues, because the article of creation is not about six-day creation or how old the earth is, things like this. That's part of it. And those are things that we need to discuss, certainly. But that is not the main problem we have with the article of creation today. The article of creation here has to do with whether things have properly ordered ends, whether things were created with particular purposes. The article of creation is not about the first few chapters of Genesis. The article of creation is about creation, not as a verb, but as a noun. It's about things that aren't God, the creatures of the world. And as it turns out, we are still today sustained by God, and we are surrounded by creation at all times. Everything we see around us is creation. So when we lose our doctrine on that, it really throws a wrench in how we think about our day-to-day lives and the world around us. So going back to the LGBT issue, like I mentioned, if you lose the idea that men and women have particular ends or final causes, or one might say goals in more colloquial English, that's not quite right, but it's close. What we call the telos. That is to say, teleology. That's where that term comes from. If you don't have that, if you don't have things ordered towards some particular end, you're going to lose everything about them in terms of God's purpose. So when men don't have the particular ends that they need to have, or they don't understand those ends with regard to their family or the government or the church, they're going to fall apart in their roles, and all the things that they're supposed to be sustaining and maintaining are going to fall apart. And the same thing with women. If women don't understand that they have particular roles as women in the family, in the state, and in the church, then everything that they do in relation to those things is going to fall apart. This applies into other parts of LGBT issues where you have particular ends of marriage. The ends of marriage are glorifying God. That's the final, what we'd say, the ultimate final cause, or the distant final cause, but is the most primary one. That goes for most things in the world, though. The more proximate final cause of marriage is going to be bearing of children. So this very easily applies into the issues of gay marriage, because gay marriages don't produce children. And so it's very obvious that it's wrong once you have your doctrine of creation in order. So when you lose the article of creation, it becomes very easy to slip into things like that. Similarly, when you lose the articles, for the article of creation for men and women with respect to church offices, you get things like women's ordination and women serving in roles in the church that are not as St. Paul describes women are to act in the church, even if they're not being pastors. Similarly, you have men who are not stepping up when they don't know their roles in the church. They're not stepping up to fill those roles either. And so we either get people who should not be pastors being pastors, or we have people who might be great pastors, but are not stepping into those roles because they are resisting for one or another reason, even though there may be some sort of internal divine call that is calling them to be a pastor. Similarly, in the state sphere and in the familial sphere, men are told to lead, and when that is lost, then the state and the family, those two realms become dysfunctional because the doctrines of egalitarianism step in, and there becomes no clear order of power, or in some cases just an inverted order of power. So I think that this is where most of the issues are, and this applies not only into these, I guess, broader discussions about roles in society or things like that, or the ordering of your marriage, but also applies into our daily lives, because everything about telos, that is to say, everything about the ends of things, the purpose of things, when that is lost, then you lose all purpose. And we see today that there is certainly an amount of nihilism in our culture, and even many people who do think we have a purpose think it is the inverted version of what Christianity is, certainly. And many people feel aimless. We have, for instance, mental health issues through the roof in the United States. And this is in part because people don't understand their place in the world. And that all comes back to article of creation. If we don't see how God created us for particular purposes, to do particular things in our particular time and place, and in relation to the others around us, when we lose that, then we are going to lose any idea of things that we're made for. And so I think that the article of creation is the article today on which the church stands or falls. Now, I could talk a lot about the article of justification and why it's not, in my opinion, the article on which the church stands or falls today. About how, I think most people's consciences are seared actually today, and they are probably living in unrepentant sin unknowingly, or rather, some of them do it knowingly but are encouraged by their own pastors. Or in other cases, I could talk about our preaching style and how Kemmerer is our preaching textbook, or how Walther's Law and Gospel is used as a homiletics text when it's not really meant for that in the first place. And I could talk about how we should use Reinhold Pieper's homiletic text, which I believe Kuntz recently translated, is put out by CPH, and there's a AI translation on archive.org for free. But those are all, to some degree, beside the point. I think that we just need to get away from this type of language and cliche being applied to today. We can apply it in the Reformation context if we're teaching about the Reformation, and that's wonderful. If we're on Reformation Day, we can talk about that. And if it comes up as one of the things in our sermons, because we're talking about the article of justification, because that's what the reading's about, great, we can talk about that then too. And there are certainly people with terrified consciences today. But I don't think it's the main issue we have. And if we're looking to attract members, not that it's about church growth, but we do want everyone in our pews, because that's where they're going to hear the gospel and receive the sacraments, which are the gospel being delivered to them physically, then we're not going to reach them at all if they're not there. So if we want to reach people and bring them in, I think we need to actually address the real spiritual issues that they have at hand. That's what our pastors are supposed to do. They're doctors of souls. And so they need to address the sickness in the souls today, which I believe are mostly around this article. So that's really all I had to say. Samuel brought this topic up to me, and I just sent the video over to him and said, I don't know how much I have to add. So hopefully this gave you something useful, a little more than what was in the original lecture by Dr. Mace. He was obviously doing Q&A, so he wasn't going to give a whole long presentation on this particular issue, he has, time constraints and whatnot, and other things to talk about Johann Gerhard. So I recommend the whole series. I hope you found this video useful. And please subscribe to Flanor Record. Hey everyone, thanks for watching another Scholastic Lutherans video. If you'd like to support us, you can follow us on Twitter at Gerhard's Ghost, or contribute on Patreon at Scholastic Lutherans. There you'll get access to our Telegram chat and other perks. Links can be found in the description. Subscribe, like, or leave a comment, and have a nice day.